Operation Supercharge was Montgomery's answer to the fact that Second El Alamein had become stuck inside its own success. The Eighth Army had broken into the Axis defensive system, but the original plan had not produced the clean armored breakthrough that would open the road west. The battle had become a grinding contest of minefields, strongpoints, local attacks, artillery fire, and exhausted infantry. By the night of 1 to the 2nd of November, 1942, Montgomery accepted that the offensive needed a new, concentrated blow. Supercharge mattered because it marked the transition from crumbling to rupture. It was designed to turn accumulated pressure into a decisive break, using infantry, engineers, artillery, armor, and timing to force open the Axis line. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
The plan did not abandon the lessons of Lightfoot. It sharpened them. Tanks could not simply be thrown at minefields and anti-tank guns in the hope that courage and horsepower would solve the problem. Infantry still had to attack first. Engineers still had to open routes. Artillery still had to suppress and disorganize the defense, and armor still had to move through the gap at the right moment. What changed was the focus. Instead of continuing to spread pressure in the same way across the existing battle, Montgomery concentrated strength for a new thrust toward the Axis rearward defenses near the Rahman track and the area associated with Tel el Aqqaqir. The aim was to punch through the remaining depth of the line and draw the Axis armor into a fight it could not sustain.
For a listener without a map, the battlefield can be imagined as a defended corridor running roughly north and south, with the Australian pressure continuing nearer the coast and Supercharge aimed farther south of that most intense coastal struggle. The Eighth Army had been pushing from east to west through the Axis line. The new blow would drive westward through a sector where Montgomery hoped the enemy had been weakened and distracted. If the attack reached the tracks behind the main defenses, British armor could begin to operate beyond the mine belts that had trapped and slowed it for days. The goal was not merely to gain another ridge or outpost. The goal was to change the battle from one of penetration into one of exploitation. The infantry spearhead was built around the New Zealand Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, a veteran commander whose formation had already carried heavy responsibilities in the desert. The New Zealanders were reinforced by British brigades, creating a mixed assault force designed to break into the next layer of defense. These infantrymen would again do what tank battle narratives often understate. They would move first into the danger that made armored movement possible. They had to cross ground still covered by mines, guns, and enemy posts. They had to secure objectives before dawn and open the way for armor to pass through. Supercharge was called an armored breakthrough operation, but its first decisive movement belonged to men on foot. The artillery plan was immense because the Eighth Army had learned that firepower had to prepare every stage of the assault. Guns would batter known positions, suppress enemy batteries, support the infantry advance, and help protect the newly gained ground from counterattack. The barrage could not guarantee that every Axis gun would be silenced, especially those well dug in or hidden in depth. But it could disrupt the defensive system, cut communications, keep heads down, and give the attackers a chance to reach their objectives before the enemy fully understood the new danger. In a battle where the Axis had repeatedly used anti-tank guns to punish movement, artillery was not background noise. It was a way of buying minutes, and minutes could open a gap.
The northern fighting made Supercharge possible because it forced Rommel to keep attention and strength near the coast. Australian attacks around Trig 29, the Fig Orchard, the Saucer, and the Blockhouse were not separate from the new plan. They were part of the pressure that made the Axis defense less flexible. Rommel could not know with perfect certainty where the decisive blow would fall, and he could not move reserves freely without fuel, time, and daylight protection. The more serious the northern threat looked, the harder it was for him to concentrate everything against the supercharged sector before the attack began. This is one of the subtler lessons of combined arms and operational design. Pinning the enemy can be as decisive as striking him.
The timing was brutal. Supercharged had to begin while the Eighth Army was tired, but before the Axis could fully stabilize the front. It had to use troops who had been preparing under the strain of a battle already more than a week old. It had to move through routes that were still crowded, damaged, and dangerous. It had to coordinate infantry, engineers, artillery, armor, and traffic control at night under the pressure of a timetable that would not wait for every uncertainty to be resolved. The Eighth Army possessed material superiority, but material superiority still had to pass through narrow lanes, congested tracks, and human confusion. A great plan could fail because a route was blocked, a marker vanished, or a report arrived too late. The Axis situation was deteriorating, but it remained dangerous. Rommel's forces had lost men, vehicles, ammunition, and fuel during the crumbling phase, and Allied air power made movement increasingly hazardous. Yet German and Italian troops still held defensive positions in depth, and the anti-tank gun lines near the Rahman track were capable of inflicting terrible losses. The Axis did not need to defeat the whole Eighth Army to stop Supercharge. They needed to slow the infantry, catch the armor as it emerged, and make the breakthrough too expensive or too disorganized to exploit. That defensive logic had worked before in the battle, and Montgomery knew it might work again if the attack lost timing. The armored role in Supercharge was therefore both essential and perilous. The 9th Armored Brigade was assigned one of the hardest tasks: to push forward after the infantry assault and force a passage through the anti-tank screen. Behind it, larger armored formations were intended to exploit if the line cracked. This sequence placed enormous pressure on the 1st Armored Wave because it would meet the enemy at the place where mines, guns, and dawn visibility converged. The story of that attack belongs in its own tragic chapter because the cost would be severe. Here, the important point is that Supercharge deliberately used armor not as a wandering desert cavalry, but as the instrument meant to convert an infantry break-in into an operational break. Engineers again stood between plan and reality. The infantry could seize ground, but armor could not pass unless routes were cleared, marked, and kept open. Minefields and obstacles in the supercharged sector were not as simple as a single belt to be crossed and forgotten. Lanes had to support the movement of tanks, anti-tank guns, ammunition, ambulances, command vehicles, and reserves. The wider the attack became, the more important route discipline became. A mechanized army is powerful only when it can move without strangling itself. Supercharge was a breakthrough plan, but it was also a traffic plan, an engineer plan, a logistics plan, and a communications plan forced into the narrow hours before dawn. At the front, the opening of Supercharge would not have felt like a clean strategic pivot. It would have felt like another night of artillery, movement, shouted orders, uncertainty, and fear. Infantry moved toward objectives in darkness while guns fired overhead. Engineers followed to handle mines and mark routes. Tank crews waited for the moment when they would be called forward into ground that others had only just fought through. Commanders listened for reports and tried to judge whether the attack was on schedule, whether the lanes were usable, and whether the enemy had begun to react. The battle was shifting toward decision, but decision still had to pass through the ordinary fog of combat. In the history of armored warfare, Supercharge is important because it shows how breakthrough is manufactured rather than wished into being. The Eighth Army did not suddenly discover a gap. It created one through days of pressure, northern attacks that fixed reserves, artillery that wore down the defense, engineers who opened movement, infantry who seized ground, and armor held for the moment when a rupture might be forced. This was not the fast, improvisational desert warfare of 1941. It was a deliberate, resource-heavy, combined arms method built to overcome mines and anti-tank depth. It pointed toward the later Allied style of war: mass, preparation, firepower, logistics, and armor used together to break an enemy who could still fight hard but could no longer recover.
Supercharge began with uncertainty, not certainty. Montgomery had concentrated strength, but he could not know whether the Axis line would crack or whether another costly penetration would stop short of open country. Rommel's army was weakened, but it was not yet broken. The Eighth Army was stronger, but strength had already learned humility in the Devil's Gardens. The coming hours would decide whether the battle remained trapped in attrition or finally opened into movement. Supercharge was the gamble Montgomery had prepared by refusing earlier gambles. It was the moment when holding in the north, crumbling in the center, and massing for a renewed blow all came together. The next episode of the battle would show the price of forcing that crack.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.